So with our efforts last week to better understand the meaning of free will, it seems appropriate that we look into how free will and our stories interact with one another. The stories we tell ourselves every day and the stories we're telling other people. If you think about it, just like any novel, any good novel we've ever read, we're full of stories, each of us. And these stories usually serve as the foundation for what we believe defines our life. Past stories, current stories, what we want to think about for the future. If you think about all the experiences each of us has had and how that might fill a book. First, we might start with relationships we've built along the way, the people we've met. Maybe talk about the places we've visited or the places we've lived, the defining moments and the turning points in our life. Maybe even our career-related journeys. But within each of those stories is a plot line. And each of those plot lines has characters. And in every chapter, we unveil the details of our journey and what our character experienced. And we're usually the main character in our stories. So as we unveil these details, we're probably talking about challenges and triumphs, the knowledge gained, the lessons learned along the way, and maybe even the decisions we made because of the knowledge we gained and the lessons we learned. But our character, if you are honest with yourself, our character is usually revealed as either a victor or a victim. And we decide what role that character has in our stories. And maybe, just maybe, occasionally, we may be willing to admit we might have been the villain in some of those. But most importantly, the words we're choosing to tell these stories will either empower us or keep us stuck right where we are. We're the author, we're the one writing the story, and we have to decide what that story is going to do for us when we take time to share it with someone else, or just to keep repeating it to ourselves. Now, if we're empowered, we're likely telling the story to remind ourselves of how far we've come. Or perhaps we're trying to help someone who's in a similar circumstance. But if we're stuck, then usually we're unable to let the story go or resolve what led to the story to begin with. And if we can't resolve how we feel about it, we keep the story going and going and going. And let's not forget, there's usually some level of embellishment in our stories. After all, what's a good novel without drama? Right? So it got bigger. Every time you tell it, it gets a little bigger. And oh, by the way, the pain is more. Your anger kind of flares up, and so you tell it with a little more anger or hurt. But regardless of the role we play in our stories or the circumstances surrounding our character, the truth is that these stories become our identity, or how we choose to see ourselves. And it's a great thing if that identity actually helps us be our best self and show up in the world as our best self. But it's not such a great thing when it's always minimizing us or making us believe that we are lacking in some way. If we don't think the plot line represents what we want in our life, we should be writing a new plot line. And the question is, for us to think about today, is why aren't we? If we don't like the plot line, why aren't we writing a new one? So I want you to think of it like this. Let's say you've told yourself for years that you're limited by your circumstances, which have either resulted in you being unhappy or struggling, perhaps financially. If that story doesn't empower you or someone you're helping or help you move forward, why do we continue to tell them? Why are we not choosing a new version? Why don't we change the plot line? Any unhealthy story that causes us to feel emotionally paralyzed is simply not a story we should want to hold on to. It isn't going to help us. And if you think about this, just try to go there with me for a minute. Think about how everything we say either stops us or propels us forward or takes us back. Everything. So if we're not moving forward, we have to look at ourselves and the words we're choosing and the stories we're telling ourselves. Viewing any situation or person in a way that is holding us back from continuing to live to our fullest is not a good idea. It's not going to help us. And it's a book we shouldn't want to continue to own. Now, years ago, when I was minister at Together in Peace, Cindy Stump shared a story with me, and I've kept this story for years because I found it so compelling. So it's a story that comes out of the novel, The Chilbury Ladies' Choir, which takes place in Britain in the 1940s. There's a woman in the choir who's just buried 3 members of her family. Her father, who died in World War I, her mother, and her husband. On top of that, her son just enlists as a fighter pilot. Well, the choir director needs this woman to sing a solo in an upcoming competition because she has a beautiful voice, but she's petrified to sing alone. So the director gets her alone in the church to rehearse so she won't be nervous, and she chooses to sing the hymn that was sung at all 3 funerals. She sings the song and later says this: "As I was singing it out alone in the church, it took on a new horror. I realized I'd been trapped by those deaths, that I had let them take over, and now I see it is time to let them go." Our words and our stories are powerful, and they can help or hurt us. And Myrtle Fillmore understood this better than anyone. In her book, Healing Letters, she said this: "To be truly healed and quickened by the life more abundant, one must forget the past and the limitations of the past, and offer every thought, every ounce of energy to spirit, to be used in bringing God's kingdom of light and love and order and beauty and health into the earth and into the lives of all people." Now, she was a pretty wise woman, as we all know, and she learned to empower her life by editing the stories she had believed her entire life about herself. We've talked about her health and her medical conditions, but we're in the same shoes as her. We are the co-creator of our stories. We're the authors. We're not marionettes on strings and someone else is jerking us around. It is us who decides how to move forward. It is us who says, this story is old, I'm done with it, I'm moving on. We have to get to a place where we're consciously aware that every story we're holding on to has an impact on us. And we need to analyze whether it's a positive impact or a negative one. Daniel Goleman helps us understand this by explaining that our emotions are not a result of our experiences. Our emotions with our stories are coming from the meaning we assigned to the experience. So we're not emotionally attached to our stories because of what happened. We're emotionally attached because of what meaning we decided they had in our life. This is a big one, this is a little one. This one was horrible, and that one not so bad. We decided that. We assigned the meaning, and so when we assign the meaning, we're going to carry around the stories that have the most meaning, but are they the most positively impactful? In any given moment, we could change the plot line. In her book, The Dance of Connection, psychologist Harriet Lerner says that letting go of our stories doesn't mean we have to forget them. But letting go is our way of protecting ourselves from the negative effects of being stuck in our story. Anger, hurt, and bitterness will zap our energy, she said, and all the energy used on these negative experiences is then no longer available for new ones. Charles Fillmore wrote in 12 Powers of Man, he talked about release or elimination, and he described it this way: learning to let go of thoughts, conditions, and substances in consciousness, body, and affairs when they have served their purpose and are no longer needed. That was the definition for him. And he explained it in the same way that our body will eliminate what it no longer needs, including air, food, and water. Our mind power has to release our old stories and negative thinking so we can discover new paths. So releasing and letting go becomes this ongoing process for us, particularly as it relates to our thoughts and the burdens of our thoughts. So if we're going to grow spiritually, we all have to continue releasing things that are holding us back and burden us and make room for the new stories. The key thing for us to realize is that we're not our stories. They're just our way of helping make sense of our life. But we aren't our stories. They are simply our experiences. We all know that we have a much bigger purpose on this earth than our stories. Now, I was trying to think of how are we going to step forward once we know that. So here's what I want to share with you, and I'm going to ask Greg to share a slide with you. So consider a story you've been repeating to yourself or others. Ask yourself, how long have you carried the story around? Repeat the story out loud or write it down. In reviewing or reading the story, decide, is there joy or there's pain? Does it make you feel good or does it make you feel bad? If it makes you feel bad or takes away your empowerment, then it's time to say goodbye and release that story. Give yourself permission to let the story go. And then close your eyes and literally see the story exiting your mind and your body and your heart. And then breathe and release. Now, if all of us would take the time to listen to ourselves and pick out the stories that we seem to hear a lot, How many of you have ever gone to a family gathering and the family starts telling the same stories? Anybody? Okay, it's probably my least favorite thing. Ask my husband. They start, and my first thought is, not that story again. But the story, if it brings joy, is the reason it gets repeated. It's a laughter moment. It's funny. It's joyful. But if you've heard it for 29 years, it's not so fun and joyful anymore. But it's great to look at that because family gatherings are how you know what are the stories that are being told. The ones that are just, oh, you remember Aunt so-and-so? You remember your uncle? Oh, I'll tell you about your uncle. Nobody wants to hear that stuff. Those stories don't bring us joy. They make us not want to get together with the family. Ultimately, we're the authors of our own stories. We're going to assign the meaning, and we have the choice of remembering our life events in ways that help us or hurt us. And I want us all to remember we were created in the light of God. And as powerful as we are, it makes little sense that we would allow any story to rob us from living as empowered spiritual beings. The path forward for all of us is to ensure our stories allow us to reflect our truth and reflect God in a divine way. Let's review our lessons for today. So releasing our stories can empower us if we're willing to first take an objective look at our stories and consider the positive or negative impact. Number 2, identify emotions attached to the story, determining why the story still matters. Number 3, assess spiritual truth in the story. Does the story represent your spirit? And number 4, choose stories that have purpose, those that will help us continue to grow spiritually. Our affirmation today is, I release stories that do not empower me. Let's say that together. I release stories that do not empower me. And you know, I have to tell you, I had to really think about that because, you know, I usually write affirmations that are on the positive side, right? I only carry the stories forward that are good for me. But there was purpose in having you practice this one so that you start to let go, and we can all let go of them. Our quote today is from Iyanla Vanzant, and I thought it was beautiful. When you stand and share your story in an empowering way, your story will heal you, and your story will heal somebody else. So let's pause now. We just take a moment to reflect upon the gift we have to choose between an empowering story and one that robs us of our empowerment. We can be victor or we can be victim. It is up to us as the author of the story. And so we say thank you, God, for the ability to have the freedom that we need to release any story that no longer serves us. And so it is. Amen.